Hello everyone. Today I'm going to show you how to deal with recliner damage in a tile environment. I do have another video out there where I use dowels, and for the most part those work, but I had a 450-pound family member show up and just flop himself down and put those poor dowels to the test. They did not have a chance and failed miserably. For a carpet environment, I would suggest just upgrading the gauge of the dowels, but in a hard floor, like in my case tile environment, I think this is a better, more practical, permanent solution. So let's get started. All right, so this is my wall. Recliner damage at its best, and this happens when someone sits in the recliner, it slides back a little, and then they proceed to recline all the way even though they feel that it hit the wall. So whole different problem, but the way you want to prevent this is you want to slide the recliner, or you want to extend the recliner as far as it'll go. Then you want to push it all the way to the wall. And once it's all the way to the wall, you want to bring it back. Maybe about half an inch should be enough. You just want to make sure that the hard part of the recliner does not touch the wall. The next thing you want to do is you want to measure from the baseboard on the wall, or from the wall to the end of the recliner. And by end, I mean the base. Usually it's some kind of a metal or wooden frame. You want to measure to that end so you know where to cut your 2x4s. And yes, I'm going to use 2x4s because I have some pretty big family members and I don't want this to happen again. So I did pre-cut some of these so that we can move on to the next step. And that next step is to pull back your recliner, distribute the 2x4s against the wall so that they hit the base of the recliner when it's pushed back. Before you push the recliner back though, you need to fasten them down. I'm using clear silicone caulk. I would recommend you use the same, but you're welcome to use whatever you want. My goal here is to keep these from sliding around so that when someone sits, it doesn't eventually move to the left or right and eventually move out of the way and put me back in the same situation that got us here. So you want to put enough to hold it down. The reason I use silicone is because if I ever want to remove these, I just have to pull the 2x4 up. It's not very difficult. And then I can take a putty knife and my finger and roll the rest of the residue off without any damage to the tile or the floor itself. Once this is done, you want to push the recliner back to make sure that you have that space you're looking for. And then I'm going to make sure that I've got a good space between the wall and the recliner. So let's take a look at that. Perfect. Now I'm going to test the recliner to make sure it doesn't hit the wall when it reclines. So here we go. Coming up. And let's go back down now. And as you can see, it is not hitting the wall. That is exactly what we're looking for. If yours is hitting the wall, you need a little bit longer piece of wood or whatever it is you're going to use. My recommendation is a 2x4. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this area and I'm going to sand it down to get rid of all the rough edges and all this mess. I'm going to use 200 grit, 300 grit, either one's fine. You just want to get a nice smooth area so that you can apply more spackle and get that repair work started. So here we go. And as you sand this down, make sure you feel it with your hand. Make sure you have a nice smooth wall as you go. Kind of flake off anything that might be rough. Try to get it as nice as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect because you are going to add more spackle. The next thing you want to do is you want to prep the area by wiping off all the sanding dust. If you do not do that, it will cause the spackle to attach to that and not the wall, and it'll just be a mess. So wipe it down with a damp rag, not wet, not dry, damp. And what the dampness does is it captures all the dust that is accumulated in the wall so that when it's all nice and clean, you're ready for the spackle. For the spackle, I'm going to use a 10-in-1 tool. I got it at Harbor Freight for a couple bucks to pull the material out of the bucket. As you can tell, my bucket is missing a lot of material, a lot of recliner problems. Hopefully this will be the last one. Then I'm taking an 8-inch putty knife, plastic cheap putty knife. I also got this at Harbor Freight for a couple bucks. The goal here is to push the material into the crevices and then give yourself a nice smooth surface that you can sand. Enemy of good is better, so don't worry about it being perfect. You can always do sand and repeat this process if needed. But the goal here is to give yourself a smooth as possible surface, sand it down, and move on to painting. Now that the spackle is nice and dry, we're going to hit it with 220 grit sandpaper just to give it a nice smooth finish. You don't want to push too hard. You want to do nice surface strokes just to get rid of the rough edges. Again, don't be a perfectionist. Just if you end up with some crevices after this, you fill those, you sand them down, and you continue the process till you get a nice surface to paint on. Next, I'm going to hit it with 400 grit sandpaper because I have it in hand, and 400 grit is going to give me a nice, cleaner surface. 220 is good enough to paint. I have 400 grit in hand. I'm going to use it because I want as clean as possible. If you're doing this by hand, it's doable, but unless you're one of those amazing skilled people, which I am not, it's going to take you forever. And I bought this sander at Home Depot for about $100 during a summer sale. But I think you can get them at Harbor Freight as well for, I don't know, 30, 40 bucks. Once the sanding is done, just like when we started, you want to take a damp rag and you want to wipe it down to catch all the dust that's going to be in the way. Otherwise, when you put your primer or paint, it's going to affect the way it adheres to the wall. So wipe it down and then we move to paint. Before I start painting, I always wet my bristles. A painter once told me that if you put a dry brush into paint, the bristles absorb the paint, making it really difficult to clean later because the paint is inside the bristles. Whereas if you wet the brush first, the bristles become soaked with water, and when they pick up the paint does not soak into the bristles that are soaked with water, making it easier to clean later. So here we go. The first thing I want to do with this wet brush is to apply primer. I use Kills too. Nothing is sponsored in my videos. You're welcome to buy whatever you want. This is just what works for me, so I'm sharing that with you. Some people prefer not to use primer. Some people do. I'm one of the people that likes to use primer because I find that I use less coats of paint and the paint actually goes on better on the wall. When I don't use primer, I get a lot of drips. Sometimes the paint starts to bubble, so I prefer to use primer. So let's let this dry and let's go clean our brush. And if you can tell, the paint's coming off really easy. And that's because the bristles were wet to start. Again, you can do however you feel comfortable with. I'm just sharing the way it works for me. It's been about 30 minutes. The primer is dry. I did get some paint color matched at Home Depot. They do a pretty good job. So let's get that paint on here and see how it does. I just basically follow the same pattern as I put on the primer. There is no real wrong way to put on paint, at least not that I can think of. A painter might be able to guide you better, but for me, this works perfect. Make sure that there's no paint clots, no drips, and for the most part, it's just putting on the paint, and the primer will do the job of absorbing the paint into it, and that's pretty much it for the painting. So let's let that dry and see how it looks. All right, the paint has dried overnight and it looks like Home Depot did a great job at the paint matching. Again, I'm not sponsored by anyone, so you can go wherever you want. I just happen to go to Home Depot, so I'm sharing that with you. First thing I want to do is I want to make sure those 2x4s, there you go, do not move. Don't push too hard. It is silicone, it'll come right off if you do. Then we want to push the recliner back in place so we can test it. And you want to push all the way back to make sure that when your heavy relatives come over and they sit, it's not going to go further than where those 2x4s allow it to be. I don't see the 2x4 from the angle, so that looks good. And I want to recline so that I can test to make sure it doesn't hit the wall anymore. So here we go. Let's recline. And it is not going to hit the wall. We're good to go. I hope this helps anybody who has the same problem I have, and good luck.